Today, we are going to change history by trying to change it as little as possible. I know it sounds paradoxical, just like the title of this video. What does it mean if the Roman Empire remained? Do I mean if the Roman Empire didn't fall? Well, no. Not that I don't like the idea of that alternate scenario like the good Romaboo that I am, but we have to admit that it's a widely used idea and one that's already been seen a lot by the community of the niche that are the Uchronias. No, today I want to see a different kind of Rome not falling. We often mention all the advances the West lost in civilization, art, philosophy, and technology as a result of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And we also often say that medieval societies took a long time to be able to regain the unity and military power that the Romans demonstrated in their Golden Age. For example, not even the English or French during the Hundred Years' War were able to muster enough soldiers for a large-scale battle as the Romans were able to do more than a millennium earlier. In general, whether you are an extreme fan of the Roman Empire or just a more general historian, we can all generally agree that it took quite a while for the medieval kingdoms to come close to matching and eventually surpassing the military power of the Romans at their peak, at least for a large portion of the Middle Ages, not all of it, but a large portion. So what if we test this in an exercise of historical fiction? What if we take the Roman Empire as it was just after Trajan's death at its peak and leave it as it is, unchanged and without any internal problems that would cause it to drastically change or evolve into something we don't know for eternity? That's really the alternate scenario we're going to explore today, one that, of course, I hope you've understood by now is completely unrealistic and impossible to happen in any way. It is purely a mental and fictional exercise with the sole purpose of entertainment. So, as I said, we're going to leave the Roman Empire as unchanged as possible, starting with the death of Trajan and the accession of Hadrian as the next emperor, and from there, we'll adapt all future situations with the Roman Empire maintaining, in one way or another, its peak forever. But that doesn't mean they are all literally becoming immortal, or that time itself would stop within the borders of the Roman Empire. No, we're simply going to let the Roman Empire be at its peak and let it continue to evolve, grow, and expand at the pace and speed it already seemed to be doing at that time. For example, the population will continue to grow, but it will only grow for all eternity at the birth rate that the Romans had back then, nothing more. And what about the emperors? Very simple, in this timeline, we're going to assume that after Nerva's accession to power, everything will remain the same until the death of Marcus Aurelius, but after that point, all the emperors will remain good and competent forever. Perhaps not always great, as Trajan or Marcus Aurelius were, but always competent and willing to use their power wisely for the good and prosperity of the empire and its people. And in the case, for example, of the military power, they will be able to deploy over the centuries to come always the number of soldiers equivalent to the same percentage of the total population at the time of their peak. For example, the Roman Empire at its height had a population of approximately 75 million people, and at the same time, an estimated number of soldiers of 400,000. Therefore, the population and soldier ratio of the Roman Empire at its height was approximately 0.5% of soldiers for the total population of the empire. So if at some point in our scenario the Roman Empire reaches, let's say, 1 billion inhabitants, its number of soldiers will be 0.5% of that population, which would be 5 million soldiers. Anyway, I hope that with all these examples you've already understood the idea of this video, which is not at all realistic. It's simply about leaving the Roman Empire at its peak, as little changed as possible throughout history up to the present, and seeing how long it would last. Of course, this doesn't mean it will be a story of a perfect Rome, because even I have to admit that even Rome in its absolute peak was not perfect. Although it's still the closest thing to perfection we've had so far. Anyway, now, without further ado, let's get started. So what was the state of the Roman Empire at the time Emperor Hadrian came to power? By that point, Rome was already the absolute master of the Mediterranean, with all those territories and provinces already directly under Roman control. They completely controlled the province of Armenia and its surrounding client states and would remain like that for the next few decades. They had also already fully annexed the new province of Dacia, although they had to partially grant autonomy to some territories within that province due to a lack of resources to sustain such a large and difficult to traverse territory. They had the Crimean coast under direct Roman control, while the rest of the Bosporan kingdom would be a client state of the empire. And in Britain, its territorial apogee was already very close to being reached, with its borders secured during Hadrian's reign by the gigantic wall he would build. While South Wales and the southwest of modern England would remain for the time being client states of the empire, As I said previously, it would be around that time as well that Rome would have reached its peak population, having a population of around 75 million people. So what was the annual birth rate of the empire at its peak? Well, not much. And actually, from what I've looked up, sources rarely put the birth rate above 0.5%, sometimes even less. ChatGPT told me, for example, that their birth rate was at most 0.3%. To be generous, let's say their annual birth rate is 0.5%, which, while very optimistic, is still an insignificant and miserable number and could seriously affect the long-term survival of the empire. Now let's start with the events that occurred in reality after Hadrian's accession. During his reign, apart from the construction of Hadrian's Wall and a totally based and absolutely necessary intervention in the province of Judea, nothing relevant or dangerous to the survival of the empire would occur. With the reign of Antoninus Pius, it would be even better, being the only Roman emperor who experienced absolute and total peace during his entire reign, without the slightest problem occurring during his time as emperor, a period of more than 2 decades of zero danger to the prosperity of the empire in the West, something that we would never see again until very recently in our history. It would be during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus at the beginning that things would begin to get complicated for the empire and its prosperity. First, there would be the invasion of Armenia by the Parthians, forcing the Romans to defend that province by sending a strong message to the Parthians, invading Mesopotamia, destroying and sacking Ctesiphon, their capital. It was also during this military campaign through Parthian territory that the Romans probably brought with them the Antonine plague, which would wreak havoc and death at all levels of society in the empire. The Antonine plague is estimated to have lasted from 165 to 180 CE and to have killed between 10 to 15% of the Roman population. If we take the higher estimate, 15%, and we add the empire's annual birth rate, which would have remained constant at its peak in this timeline, by 180 CE, the empire would still have a population of approximately 87 million inhabitants even after all those deaths. Again, I want to clarify that I'm not claiming that the Roman Empire in 180 CE in our reality had 87 million inhabitants. That would be an absurd and complete exaggeration. That number only applies to this alternate reality, where the Roman birth rate would have remained the same as at its peak for forever, for eternity. Otherwise, it would obviously be much lower than the estimate I gave. But returning to the events that marked the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it would be, of course, the death of his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, also probably killed by the Antonine plague, although we are not sure, and of course the Marcomannic Wars, where for the first time the Roman Empire would finally realize the true threat that the Germans were beginning to represent to its borders and its future prosperity. Marcus Aurelius's idea was that, after having finally neutralized and annihilated the rebellious and violent population of those Germanic tribes with which he was at war, to conquer those territories and integrate them into the Roman Empire, placing there new Roman settlers, veteran soldiers, and loyal generals capable of having a more advantageous defense against the rest of the Germanic tribes beyond the borders of the Danube. Sadly, that idea would be abandoned by his son Commodus, who would succeed him before completely finishing the campaign, abandoning the territories already acquired by his father, and beginning his reign of terror and degeneration that would initiate the long and painful decline of the empire. But not in this story, because as I said, as unrealistic as it may be, we are going to keep the Roman Empire at its peak forever, and for that, we need, again, as unrealistic as it may sound, for all the emperors to remain good and competent, no matter what. Therefore, from this point on, I will not be able to be specific about the internal situation of the empire, nor of its emperors, who will be completely fictional and invented. Just keep in mind that the Roman Empire remains as similar as possible in its most intrinsic infrastructure and in all its cultural aspects, as close as possible to what it was at its height in reality, but in this story, forever. So, Commodus does not rise to power, and someone else succeeds Marcus Aurelius, someone who is still as good and competent as the other 5 previous good emperors. This new emperor would continue the Marcomannic conquests and wars of Marcus Aurelius until finally annihilating all violent and rebellious Germanic force and resistance, wiping out the population of those tribes and annexing those territories to the Roman Empire, creating a clear and defined border beyond the Danube that would serve for future battles and wars of the Romans against the Germans. And looking at all the challenges and problems that the Roman Empire faced during Commodus's reign, absolutely all of those problems occurred because of him. In fact, with another good and competent emperor like the previous 5 emperors, Roman peace and stability would have been quite similar to the reign of Antoninus Pius, with no major problems occurring in the empire, although still recovering from the remnants of the Antonine plague. However, even if the reign of that alternate emperor to Commodus would be stable for the interior of the empire and with most of its borders and enemies, the new emperor, having carefully studied the Marcomannic Wars of Marcus Aurelius, and having experienced it himself during that time, the huge danger of the Germans, he would surely take advantage of the absolute peace and tranquility in the rest of the empire to continue expanding throughout the Germanic world. Now, with a firm foothold in Germanic territory, although it may be difficult, I find it hard to believe that once again, a Rome at its eternal peak could not eventually conquer most of the Germanic world and absolutely wipe out all the most violent and uncivilized tribes such as the Alemanni or the Vandals, for example. Considering all of that, and that all the emperors in this very hypothetical scenario would all be good and competent, it is possible that someone alternative to Septimius Severus in this timeline could successfully invade and conquer Caledonia or modern Scotland due to all the Germanic territories now conquered, and the morale of the Roman troops and people restored by those conquests, which would once again give confidence in their expansion capacity and martial vigor to the Roman Empire and its people. A martial confidence and vigor that would arrive just in time for the first confrontation between the Romans and the new dynasty of Sassanid Persians trying to invade their borders. But again, we're talking about a hypothetical Rome that would remain at its peak forever, and in our reality, Rome at its peak was literally able to invade, conquer, and temporarily annex part of Persian territory. At the time, it was not an easy task, and it was too costly to maintain that province in the long term, being perfectly understandable to abandon it. But now, more than a century after that event, and still at its peak, and with a Sasanian dynasty still establishing itself in its new territory that it now controlled, it would be very vulnerable to invasion, and this time a true conquest of at least a part of the Persian territory by the Romans could be possible, because remember that here, although very low, the Roman birth rate would have constantly remained at its peak since the time of Trajan, so by the time the first war between Sassanians and Romans would start, the empire would already have a population of over 112 million inhabitants, which is more than 5 times the total Persian population at that time, and therefore of those 112 million based on our previous calculations, they would have more than 560,000 soldiers to their disposition to control all those new and vast territories, reducing the legacy of the Sasanian dynasty to little more than a joke of what it was in our reality. With all of this, and a constant succession of good and competent emperors, Rome would not suffer any crisis during the 3rd century, nor would it begin to progressively succumb to Germanic invasions like the first invasions of the Goths or Franks that would occur at that time, since those tribes were either already under Roman control or were completely annihilated to the last member. The various Sassanid battles and wars would not occur either, as Persian territory would already be conquered, and imperial stability, as in the time of Trajan, would prevent the empire from dividing into various factions. Apart from another epidemic such as the Cyprian plague, which would have caused fewer deaths than the Antonine plague anyway, the empire at its eternal peak in this reality, for now, would have been able to resist all the external problems that threatened it. During the 4th century, the Pax Romana would be reinforced by literally nothing happening in the way of internal or external problems for much of that century, as most of the invasions the Romans had to face during that century were Germanic. But here, the Germans were already fully under Roman control, and finally, it was a century when more or less no serious plagues or epidemics were recorded for the Romans. The most notable thing would happen the following century, during the 5th century, where a gigantic empire that had not split into two, because remember, it is Rome at its peak that we are talking about, would face the arrival and invasion of the Huns, as we all know. Now, I could go into detail and analyze how and why the Romans would defeat the Huns, but let's be honest, if that Rome, in its pathetic state and only a few decades prior to its fall, could repel and defeat the Huns, then it is completely impossible that a Rome eternally at its peak as in the times of Trajan could not easily annihilate the Huns, probably being the only clear example of comparison between our reality and this alternate story that does not need any argument, at least in my opinion. But yeah, Eternal Prime Rome wins against the Huns easy. During the 6th century, again, all the problems that would have been problems for Rome or Byzantium at that point would have been either Persian or Germanic, so that century would again be one where nothing would happen, except for two very serious events that would be a severe blow to the empire. First, there would be the multiple volcanic explosions in the year 536 CE that would occur for much of the year in the skies of the planet, losing a huge portion of plantations and crops that would create a famine crisis in certain areas of the empire, but also, and much worse than that, would be the Justinian plague, which would cause between 20 and 30% of the Roman population to die from that plague. But again, we must compare with our reality to have a point of reference if a Roman Empire amputated of its western half in constant war and defensive position due to the multiple invasions it was experiencing from all sides, while trying to reconquer the part of its empire that had fallen decades before, could survive all those catastrophic events and last for another 900 years, then that Roman Empire at its eternal peak would have no problem doing the same despite the difficulties and deaths. In this alternate scenario, with Rome perpetually at its peak and its birth rate perpetually at its highest, the population of the empire by the time the Justinian plague arrives would be approximately of 450 million people. Even taking the most extreme and highest number from the spread of the Justinian plague, which would be 30% of the population after the first major wave of that plague, there would still be approximately 315 million inhabitants left. And with no wars to be fought over any part of the empire apart from some minor invasions by Slavic barbarian peoples in the end, and for now, Rome would continue to survive that century without any major long-term consequences. And by the end of the 6th century and the beginning of the 7th century, with no other external threats and with the empire slowly recovering from the Justinian plague, they would focus most of their resources on neutralizing these Slavic invasions and plunderings, taking advantage of the opportunity to expand even further beyond the Danube and the province of Dacia, annexing, conquering, assimilating, and annihilating the Avars and other troublesome peoples of that time. Then in the 7th century, without a devastating Sasanian war, and with all Slavic threats from the north neutralized, there would be absolutely no danger or problem of instability along all the borders of the Roman Empire, except for one, a single event that we all already know. By 637 CE, the first Islamic Caliphate had spread throughout Arabia, eventually reaching the Roman and Sasanian borders, beginning the brutal invasions and massacres that would culminate a few decades later in the total conquest of North Africa and all of Persia. Now remember, we are talking about prime pagan-based Trajan-style Roman Empire at its absolute peak, with all of its societal, cultural, and martial vigor having remained at its absolute prime since all this time. In our history, the Roman Empire was demographically and economically destroyed. Almost 2 centuries of constant wars, conflicts, famines, and deaths from diseases like the Justinian plague had passed. And to top it all off, the war between them and the Sassanid Persians lasted more than 25 years, leaving the empire practically depopulated and abandoned in many areas, with almost no soldiers to defend its borders. To give you an idea, it is estimated that at the time of the Islamic invasions in 637 CE, the Roman Empire had at most an estimated population of between 15 to 20 million people, nothing more. In this context, no wonder that the first Islamist Caliphate was able to so easily penetrate and conquer Roman and Persian territories in such a short time. But here, the Arabs would not be facing an empire on the verge of demographic collapse and with practically no soldiers to defend its borders, but rather this monstrous and gigantic mass that would be the Roman Empire still at its absolute peak in all possible and inimitable aspects. With the population of the empire in this totally unrealistic scenario, having maintained a constant birth rate since its peak, which would have led it to have, at the time of the first Islamic invasions, a population of more than 510 million inhabitants, which in turn gives the empire access to over 2,500,000 soldiers, or over 500 Roman legions at its disposal, with the majority being available to fight, as there would not be other conflicts for the empire. While the Islamic Caliphate, counting its population around the territories of its peninsula, and just before attacking the Romans and Persians, had a population of approximately 10 million people and only between 40,000 and 100,000 soldiers, Given the hostile and difficult terrain of the Middle East and Arabia, I have no doubt that even with their absolute numerical inferiority, the Arabs would cause many problems and wreak a lot of havoc in that area of the empire, momentarily invading Mesopotamia and the Levant, causing several sackings and sieges of multiple important cities and provinces in the area for a couple of years. But with the lack of organization, the minuscule inferior population, and an equally minuscule number of soldiers compared to the Romans, plus the absence for the time being of the writings of the Quran to unify in a more total and absolute way the recently converted Arabs to Islam throughout the peninsula, it would be difficult that after years of constant sieges, their forces and resources would be worn down by the constant response of the Romans to their looting and invasions. It is impossible that in the long term they would not be totally pushed back to their peninsula, and worse, invaded, annihilated, and completely destroyed and conquered by the Romans, a luxury that the empire could afford in those circumstances by having a population literally more than 50 times greater than that of the Arabs at that time, and in the process, developing new trade routes with India and China. Once again, the empire at its eternal peak survives. During the 8th century, with the Islamic threat neutralized, the century would be one of total prosperity without any external threat, except perhaps the arrival in their territories of a new type of Slavs, the Bulgars, but again, being nomadic Slavs with little organization and in constant immigration movement, facing a monstrously overpopulated empire, and with all the Germanic and Central European territories secured, it is impossible for them to represent a real threat to the empire in its eternal apogee. From now on, we'll go a little faster. During the 9th century, more of the same, with all threats from our timeline neutralized, peace would be virtually uninterrupted, except perhaps for the first invasions and plunderings of another kind of Slavs, this time the Kievan Rus, the distant ancestors of today's Russians and Ukrainians. As for the potential Norse or Viking threat, I wouldn't be too worried about it either. After the initial Viking invasions and raids across Britain, Denmark, and other parts of the northwest of the empire, they will realize they couldn't forever confront an empire as ancient, gigantic, and monstrously populated as the Roman Empire, which by that point would have had over 1.2 billion inhabitants, including all the pandemics and natural disasters like earthquakes that the empire would have suffered despite its prosperity, and the Vikings will realize that they had much more to gain by allying with the Romans and trading with them than by invading and plundering them. Indeed, the Vikings were a people distantly related to the Germans, who, unlike the Germans of our reality, despite being naturally very impulsive, aggressive, wild, and barbaric in their actions and way of being, paradoxically, they were also capable of great social and political intelligence, an unparalleled adaptability to civilize themselves and to be rational people when they felt like it, and thought they had more to gain by behaving civilly than as the barbarians that their instincts dictated them to be, a perfect mix between civilization and savagery compared to the Germans. With all of this in mind, I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings played their cards right. They could benefit from a close relationship with the Romans, especially on a trade level, potentially becoming client states of the Romans, and even allies who could mutually benefit from all of that. It's even possible that, to benefit their new allies, the Romans would partially conquer the island of Ireland, transforming it into a client state for new Viking settlers and colonists so that they could live in more hospitable lands than their northern ones. During the 10th century, it would be more of the same, with the only concrete threat being the repeated invasions and looting of the Kievan Rus, but now with the new allies that were the Vikings, and with their habit of living and surviving in such cold and northern territories, they could now help the Romans in turn, collaboratively conquering the kingdom of Kievan Rus, annexing it as another client state, also controlled by Norsemen. During the 11th century, a new challenger would arrive from the far eastern steppes, the Seljuk Turks, and again, I'd like to make this situation more entertaining and challenging, but no matter where you look, the Romans at their height in the 2nd century had superior military technology, superior societal and governmental organization, and overwhelming numerical superiority, and that just being the real Roman Empire of Trajan here would be even worse, with even an area as unpopulated as the Persian lands being easily defensible to repel and annihilate the Seljuk Turks, with those being unable to establish a foothold in the Middle East or Anatolia in this story that, I want to remind to all of you for the 1000th time, is not realistic at all. During the 12th century, absolutely nothing would happen. We are starting to get used to it. Moving on. During the 13th century, I think this is a part many of you were waiting for. Romans versus Mongols, a hypothetical confrontation well known among the alternate history niche community. Now, this is finally getting interesting, finally a worthy opponent for the Empire, undoubtedly a battle that will be legendary. First, let's remember that at that point, our hypothetical eternally thriving Roman Empire would be this big, and that its population would be around 3 billion people spread across its gigantic territory of this alternate, unrealistic story, potentially having an army composed of 3,000 legions of 5,000 men, while the army of the Mongol Empire with which those nomads traveled to Europe to invade the West would have been composed at most of a few 100,000 or a few million of civilians under Mongol control, and with at best 130,000 men to lead their invasion of those lands. However, the Mongols would have multiple advantages against the Romans eternally at their peak, but also eternally stagnant, which would make them have serious problems in certain aspects that made the Mongols more technologically advanced. They had far superior composite bows in range and power than the Roman bows. They had superior cavalry, with each Mongol having at least 3 to 5 horses that had to be constantly changed in battles and prolonged wars, an aspect in which the early Roman Empire did not excel at all, its cavalry being a force that would not be developed until much later in its army, and remember here the Romans would not advance technologically, or as little as possible, so that the comparison is fair with future threats in this hypothetical scenario. And to add to all of that, that same cavalry could cover a vast amount of terrain, allowing them to move between 100 to 200 kilometers per day. An absolute unthinkable madness for the Romans and their poor mobility of 30 to 50 kilometers per day, something that could greatly compensate for the Mongols' numerical disadvantage. They also had more ways for tactical communication than the Romans, like signal flags, horns, smoke, and pre-planned maneuvers, a better siege engineering system and adaptation, and even worse of all, some of them had even primitive fire weapons with gunpowder. So honestly, I think that a war between Mongols and hypothetical Romans at its eternal peak would be a brutal and bloody war, where there would be an absurd amount of deaths on both sides, with the Mongols managing to conquer a large part of the northernmost territories of Rome, merely taking advantage of their tactical advantage and technological superiority, at least in military terms, but they would still be unable to completely conquer and destroy the Roman Empire at its deepest foundations, but massively reducing it in territory. After all, the Mongols were very good at allying the conquered local population to their cause, showing great tolerance for those conquered peoples and relative autonomy from the central Mongol government, but also an unparalleled bloodthirsty brutality that would make even the most masculine of the Nordics or Germans of those areas tremble in fear, being forced to swear loyalty by the sheer terror that such an empire of nomads technologically and militarily superior to Rome would show. Rome survives this terrible confrontation with the Mongols, however, ending up severely reduced in territory and ultimately outmatched in many technological, tactical, and military aspects that would force them to adopt a more defensive position of their main territory around the Mediterranean, as well as losing approximately half of their population due to all the territories conquered by the Mongols. But despite all of this, as we know, the Mongols would be unable to keep their empire united in the long term, fragmenting into several parts very quickly after their massive initial expansion throughout Eurasia. But that doesn't mean the Roman Empire could take advantage of this situation to reconquer its former territories. After several decades under Mongol control, these different fragmented parts of the Mongol Empire, often controlled and administered by the local population, would reject Roman authority after all that time, seeing that they could not defend them during the Mongol invasion, and they also preferred to govern themselves to maintain the power of their kingdoms and small empires, creating a situation of extreme rivalry and tension between the former Roman territories and the Roman Empire itself, especially if those new territories adopted new technologies and military innovations from the Mongols, something the central Roman Empire is prohibited and nerfed from doing in this unrealistic story, to remain fair in this very hypothetical exercise of fiction. But it would truly be during the 14th century that we would truly see the limits of the Romans at their eternal height against the adversities of the future. Apart from the constant wars and battles between the different fragmented Mongol and Roman dynasties and kingdoms, which would further reduce their population, I am of course referring to the famous Black Death, which would create unparalleled devastation around the Mediterranean, even more so in this story, and we will see why. You see, although for a long time medieval medicine was far behind the scientific and medical knowledge of the Romans at their peak, and in some aspects it was until the end of that era, there is no doubt that by the 14th century, medieval Europe was far better prepared and scientifically knowledgeable to survive the Black Death than the Romans would have been, especially when compared to the Romans' terrible handling of the Antonine plague and the Justinian plague. So the spread of the plague would be even worse than in medieval Europe in this alternate scenario, with the Romans having much fewer means and knowledge to slow down the devastating waves of that pandemic, and even with all the population they would have lost due to the territories conquered by the Mongols, plus the repeated deaths from wars and battles with the fragmented kingdoms and empires of those same Mongols, the population around the Mediterranean in our fictional exercise would still be approximately 1 billion. With that gigantic population and the extreme ease with which the plague would spread in that context, I think the Black Death would have devastated much more than half of the Roman population, at least 75%, and I'm being very conservative and optimistic. But if it's even that percentage, that would mean that after the Black Death, the population of the Roman Empire would have been reduced to 250 million inhabitants. But if we also add the wars and battles that would have followed during that time, plus the deaths caused by the panic of such chaos and the terrible famine crises throughout the empire that the population would have suffered due to a lack of workers to farm and grow food for the entire empire, we could reduce that number to around 125 million by the end of the 14th century. And while all of that would have happened with the Roman Empire, despite everything surviving until now, being forbidden to change or evolve from its closest form to its peak in the 2nd century, by the 15th century of this alternate reality, the different kingdoms and dynasties of the former territories of the Mongol Empire, having advanced technologically, militarily, and socially, could take advantage of the situation to expand their territories with a severely depopulated Roman Empire and with a gigantic social and economic instability within it due to the loss of so many inhabitants not being able to defend itself properly from these invasions, with new kingdoms and empires having plenty of important developments as them developing firearms similar to those of that time in our reality, something against which the Romans could not resist, ending up dividing due to the chaos and fragmenting into several territories, probably losing a large part of its provinces, and finally ending with the Roman Empire as we know it, having to reinvent itself and adapt to a fall of its gigantic empire to survive the influence of the different northern and eastern kingdoms and empires that would have conquered them, ironically collapsing and falling around the same time that Constantinople fell in our true history. And here you have it. That's the point in history where the Roman Empire could very hypothetically have survived if it had remained at its eternal peak during the Pax Romana. It was clearly impressive, showing how powerful and far ahead of its time the empire was back then in all the aspects that make up a great civilization, and no wonder in our true reality it lasted for so long. Rome was clearly exceptional in the history of humanity. But even so, the most important conclusion we can reach with this exercise of fiction, which is not at all realistic and impossible to have occurred, is that regardless of all the threats the Romans faced in their history, Carthaginians, Gauls, Germans, Slavs, Persians, Arabs, Mongols, or Turks, Rome's greatest enemy and its greatest obstacle to becoming the largest and most powerful empire in history, and one that could last for all eternity, was always and always will be itself. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.